QSO Today, episode 315, Mark Smith, KR6ZY. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. While the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is in the on-demand mode until September 9th, I now have time to bring you new episodes of the QSO Today podcast. Most of the speakers at the expo had been my guests on earlier QSO Today episodes. However, there were a number who had not been my guests and made fine presentations. With this in mind, I thought to bring you these presenters, these hams, so that you'll know more about them when you recall their presentations. Mark Smith, KR6ZY, has been a ham since the mid-90s and finds problem-solving in building his area of our ham radio hobby. Trained and graduated a computer engineer, Mark resides near the Central California coast. Mark is a frequent contributor to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast and has his own YouTube channel. KR6ZY is my QSO Today. KR6ZY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mark?
4Z1UG from KR6ZY. I am here. How's it going, Eric?
It's going great, Mark. And you?
I'm doing all right.
Mark, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a ham since high school in the early 90s. I worked at an electronics junk store up in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, a store called Haltech, TEK Electronics, not to be confused with Halted, TED Electronics, also known as HSC. This is a different store up in Mountain View, California. And the guy I worked for, his name was Russ Rocket, and I should have looked up his call sign before recording, but he was a ham radio operator. And so I was working for him, and he's the one who encouraged me to get licensed. And he and one other gentleman I worked with at the time named Greg Creech, we both went up to Ampex and got our licenses during the summer. And so I used it a little bit during high school. Not a whole lot, because I didn't know a whole lot of other hams other than Russell and Greg. But when I got to college is when my ham radio hobby really took off.
Let's go back a second, though. What was your first call sign?
KD6JTS, Kilo Delta 6 Juliet Tango Sierra, or just a teenage snot.
And did you use that on the air?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was KD6JTS until the late 90s or early 2000s. So all through college, I was JTS.
What license level was that?
Technician. I started out as no code. I got my 5 words a minute, so to be a Tech Plus pretty early on at my time in college. And then I did manage to pass my 13 words a minute to get my advanced license before they removed the code requirements in the U.S. entirely.
And why did you go to Ampex? What was that Ampex? For anybody that remembers, Ampex was a big company that made audio recorders, but I think they also went into digital data, didn't they?
Honestly, I knew them from audio tape recorders, but that's just where they happened to be holding the license exams back in the early 90s in the Bay Area when I went to go get licensed there. I don't think I chose it other than it was the closest exam.
But if you were working at Haltech Electronics in San Francisco, did that mean that you already had an interest in electronics, even before you got the ham radio bug?
Yes. Ever since I was a young kid, I was playing with batteries and lights and switches and motors and all of that sort of thing. I was very much a Lego child. I had a lot of Lego Technics kits growing up, and I would make robots out of them, like fully functional robotic arms with motors and gears and everything, not just the big stompy robots that kids like to play with. But I was making functional robots, walking robots, arms, all kinds of things. And I made a little control box out of a Radio Shack project box and some switches and batteries to drive all of the motors and be able to control these things. So I've been into electronics since a very young age. Excuse me. I've been into electronics since a very young age. And I knew And I was also into computers. My dad worked for IBM for 32 years, and my mom was a network administrator at the local high school. So I was kind of doomed to be a computer nerd from birth. And, we had a TRS-80 in the house. We had PCs. I was mostly PCs and DOS growing up. And so I knew that I wanted to do some sort of a combination between electronics and computers. When I went to university, I studied electrical engineering for the first 2 years, and then I switched to computer engineering at the beginning of my third year, because my first 2 years, computer engineering was not an accredited license or a degree at that university, but they got their accreditation my third year. And so I switched over to computer engineering. And so I kind of knew that I was going to be doing electrical stuff and computer stuff pretty early on. And then when I got to the school in 1993, I found the internet, and that ended up pretty much defining my actual career. And all of the electronics stuff, like the lower level electronic stuff, ended up becoming a hobby for me.
And where did you go to school?
Cal Poly, California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. It's had a very active ham radio club. W6BHZ, the Big Hairy Zebra, has been a very active club since the 50s, I think, is when it was created. It's been around a good long time, and it's been active for most of that time. I started in 93, and I joined the club just as there was a big wave of students that were graduating from the club. And so I kind of learned a little bit about the club and ham radio from them. But there were a lot of people at about my year that were coming in at that time. So I got there right at the beginning of kind of a new wave of W6BHC. There were several students that overlapped, but we definitely had kind of a new wave of students. There were probably 10 or 20 of us going through at the time, and a lot of us are still really good friends. And that defined about half of my social life, half to 3/4 of my social life through college. There were a few other groups that I hung out with as well, but that was the majority of it was BHZ.
Well, the truth be known, I pined after going to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. As a student myself, I ended up going to the University of California, Santa Barbara, and it was because I was there I couldn't go to Cal Poly because I was already in a school. But can you talk a little bit about your Cal Poly experience? Did you find that was a quality education there?
Oh, heck yeah. Actually, a funny story. You said you were at UC and you wanted to go to Poly. I was at Poly and was trying to go to Berkeley. Both of my older sisters, were graduates of Berkeley when I started college, and I tried to apply there. And for various reasons I won't bore you with now, I didn't get accepted there, but I did get accepted at Cal Poly. So Cal Poly was my quote-unquote second choice school. Turns out, in hindsight, it was absolutely the best school for me. Cal Poly's motto is learn by doing. And I hesitate to say it this way, but I have a slight learning disability. I'm not a great book learner. I'm not a great academic learner. I am very much a sit down and do a thing or have somebody explain something to me while I am doing it kind of learner. And in hindsight, from looking at how UC Berkeley teaches versus how Cal Poly teaches, I absolutely ended up going to the right school. And it took me 6.5 years to get my bachelor's degree, which is a little bit longer than most people take. But, I enjoyed school, and I was working through a lot of it. I worked at least part-time, if not full-time, through several of my quarters at Cal Poly. So I don't really feel bad about it taking me that long. But as a school, it is very much learn by doing. And that's not just a motto. That is very much how they do it. It's not, all right, we're going to read a book to figure out how something works. It's read the book to get the high level understanding, and then we're going to go into the lab and actually put these things together. And there's a lot of that. And that is very right up my alley for how I learn.
Well, that's exactly why I wanted to go to Cal Poly, because I had exactly the same problems. Now, by the time, I want to make you feel better, Mark. I was in UC Santa Barbara for 7 years. I was married in the last year of my 7 years there, and my wife says, you now have enough credits to graduate in just about anything but engineering, so you need to declare a major and get the heck out. So I declared a major in history, and it was because I didn't go to Cal Poly that probably I didn't get the engineering degree, because I was a hands-on learner and not a theoretical learner, and the University of California was very theoretical at the time. And I'm glad to hear that. There was a very active ham club when I was at Santa Barbara, and we were always talking to the guys at Cal Poly. It was about 100 miles north of Santa Barbara, so that's what I remember. So what happened to your career then? You graduated from Cal Poly. What did you do?
So when I was at Cal Poly, I found the internet, and I found Unix. I found Linux. My very first kernel compile, if we're going to pull out dates here, my very first kernel compile was version 0.99 patch level 13G. I still remember the exact version it was. This is very early SLS distribution, very early Linux. And it took 36 hours to compile that kernel. And for any Unix admin who's ever compiled a kernel knows exactly the implications of 36-hour kernel compile. And once I found Linux and the internet, I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. And so my career went down the path of internet communications, or communications in general, specifically targeting internet. So a lot of network engineering, a lot of systems administration, not so much writing the applications, but running the platforms that the applications run on. So running the networks, running the systems, making it all scale, making it all reliable, setting up the monitoring and the alerting and all of that fun stuff. I mean, there was a lot of that going on in the 90s, right? Everybody was kind of figuring it out. You didn't really need a degree because there was no degree on how to make the internet work. So those of us who could just kind of figure it out on the fly are the ones who got the jobs. I went to school with a whole bunch of people that never got their degree. You know, I joke about it taking 6.5 years for me to get my degree, but at least I got it. And I say at least, like it actually mattered. I look at my friends who never got their degrees, and it has not impacted their career at all for what they are doing. I do not recommend not getting a degree. I still think there's a lot of benefit to it, a lot of value to it. I'm not trying to say that, but anyway. So I got my degree in computer engineering, and I went into networking and system administration and spent the first mumble years of my career doing that, probably 10 or 15 years or so.
Did you return to the Bay Area?
No. I actually still live in the San Luis Obispo area. I moved here and I managed to find work in San Luis Obispo. I met my then girlfriend, now wife, while attending classes at Cal Poly. We got married after I graduated, and she was able to find a job here as well. She moved to the coast of California from the Central Valley. So from a small town to San Luis, which is a medium-sized town, I moved from the Bay Area down to San Luis Obispo. So from a big metropolitan area down to a medium-sized town. And we kind of met in the middle. And she didn't want to move to a more populated area. I didn't really want to move to a less populated area. San Luis Obispo is a beautiful area, so we're like, all right, we'll stay here. And we've managed to find jobs, and we own a house just south of San Luis Obispo in a town called Arroyo Grande. We managed to make it work here, so we haven't had to go anywhere else.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers, in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo, or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HAIL geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. Well, I remember Cal Poly had one famous hotel at the entrance of Cal Poly, right, that had the bathroom, the men's room that had the waterfall as the urinal?
Yeah, Madonna Inn. Yep.
Cal Poly and the Madonna Inn were the only things in San Luis Obispo up until probably the 90s. It's now a suburb of the major metropolitan areas then.
San Luis Obispo?
When you say a suburb, 200 miles out. But what kind of industry does it have? Is it mostly people like you that could work from home, or does it have manufacturing? What's going on there now?
Yeah, so we actually have a fair number of tech companies. I mean, it's not as big as the Bay Area, obviously, but so my employer is... I don't represent them. It's not a secret who I work for, but I'm not going to talk about it because I don't represent them. Let's just say I work for a very large tech company. We have an office in San Luis Obispo. In fact, we have two offices in San Luis Obispo. So we employ several hundred people in San Luis. It's not like I'm working remote. My team is local. And, we're probably the largest company in San Luis Obispo that has an office here, but there are other companies like MindBody, is headquartered here, and they employ thousands of tech individuals and customer service and sales and all kinds of things. And then their PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility, is a large employer in the area of technology individuals, like mostly for the nuclear power plant. There's a nuclear power plant here, at least for another several years before they close it down. But Diablo Nuclear Power Station is just outside of San Luis Obispo. So they're a large employer. There are a lot of smaller tech companies in the, ones to tens to low hundreds of employees that are here as well. So it's not like we don't have any industry here. It's not anywhere near the Bay Area or LA, but there's still jobs to be had here if you like the area and want to stay here and do computer work or engineering work. There's a lot of aerospace here, believe it or not. Some submarine work here as well, and just lots of little contractors and individuals.
It's a far cry from what it was in the 80s when people would go to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and then leave the area because there was nothing there. Well, let's get back to ham radio a little bit. Okay, so you have this technician license, you upgraded to advanced, and you had to learn the 13 words a minute in order to get that license. What did you gravitate to in ham radio that caught your interest?
So through college, we had a very tight-knit community here in town. And so it was mostly VHF, UHF repeater operations. And it was a chat group, right? I mean, we all monitored the repeater all the time. We carried our HTs around with us like big nerds, going through the grocery store, right? There was a time in my life where I must have thought I was Batman or something because I wanted all of the devices on my belt. I am way past that time in my life now. But at the time, I had a pager for work, a personal pager. I had my work cell phone. I had my ham radio thing. I had my Leatherman. I looked like Batman with this utility belt. And we carried our HTs with us everywhere. And we were always on the repeater chatting. And so that was most of the operating I did there. We did do field day several times when I was as part of the club. But most of the people that were in my quote-unquote wave through Cal Poly were not HF operators. There were definitely some exceptions to that, but it wasn't a big HF group. The group that came in before me were a bunch of HF operators. In fact, they actually went on a de-expedition. My first meeting at Cal Poly, I started during the summer, and so they had just come back from a de-expedition that they did that summer of 93. And they put together a slideshow or a video. It might have been a literal slideshow. I honestly don't remember. But they put together this presentation of their de-expedition and presented it at the meeting. To this day, I can't remember what de-expedition it was, but it happened in the summer of 93. So somebody who knows that stuff better than I do can probably figure that out. And then a lot of those people graduated out. And so we didn't have a lot of HF in the club at the time. It was mostly VHF, UHF, and repeater operation. We ran a lot of T-hunts on 2 meter. That was a lot of fun. And we had a nice HF station at the shack, but I don't think that many of us used it. And then after I graduated, one of the companies I went to go work for was a company called ComDev. And it was a local tech company that did cellular phone base stations and base stations and terminals, 1X EVDO era, so 2001, 2002 era. And the guy who ran that company, Josh Lober, he's W6CUB now. I can't remember what his call sign was at the time. It was something else. But he was a ham, and we were doing radio stuff, but employing a whole bunch of electrical engineers and computer engineers. But our product was radio-based. It was, CDMA cellular phone technology. And so to encourage the employees to learn a little bit about radio that they were going to be dealing with, he instigated a program where if you got your license or upgraded your license, he would buy you a VX5R, an HT, a Yaesu HT. And a lot of people took him up on that. So we held a whole bunch of testing sessions. We had an active club, K6ZY. We had Gordon West. We had Gordon West come up from LA and present to us. We ran T-hunts as a part of that club. And Josh bought an HF vertical and an HF station, HF radio, and we set it up at the office. And so we had this R8 on the roof, a Cushcraft R8, and an FT920 down in a room that was dedicated to a shack at the office. And so we started doing a lot of HF there. Yeah, at the time, it was mostly just kind of operating and whatnot. I also got into APRS.
So Josh got the FT920 HF rig, and you have the low-band antenna on the roof. Did that create some interest for you there before you went on to APRS?
It did, a little bit. Not as much as I would have liked. I've never... So we unfortunately only had that shack for several months. I worked there for about a year, and then the company ended up going out of business for reasons, and we had to take down that shack. So we actually didn't get a chance to use it a whole lot, unfortunately. But the APRS, that's where I wanted to go with this. The APRS is very active. Locally near San Luis Obispo, just north, every year there's been an event called the Wildflower Triathlon. It's a half marathon triathlon. Half Ironman triathlon, and the W6BHZ Amateur Radio Club has been providing communications for it almost since the very beginning, since the early to mid 90s. I know I've been involved in it. And part of our jobs were to be chase vehicles on the 57-mile bike ride around Lake San Antonio in South Monterey County. And we used to do it in cars, and we'd have a mobile rig in the car, and we'd call back to net control and say, hey, I'm at mile marker 72, or 72 is too big, 42 or whatever it is. And then we learned about APRS, and we started building trackers to put in the cars. And then we realized that cars on the track were dangerous because they're huge compared to bikes. So we ended up getting motorcycle riders, and I had a motorcycle at the time. And so I ended up building an APRS rig to put on my motorcycle. And now I'm riding on this 57-mile bike course with the bicycles and magically showing up on a map back at net control. And that map would be visible by the announcers who were calling the event back at the festival area. So now you've got this person speaking into a PA to thousands of people, tens of thousands of people at a festival, looking at a map of exactly where I am, and I am on the motorcycle following the lead cyclist around the course, so they know where the lead cyclist is. And now the only thing I have to report is, lead cyclist is cyclist number 17 or whatever it is, right? Or there's been a lead change, number 24 just came up and passed 17, those kinds of things, instead of having to continuously report in my location. So that got me into APRS and building APRS receivers and transmitters and beacons and all kinds of fun things, and trying to figure out how to get it to work on a motorcycle where you don't have much of a ground plane and you don't have much of a power system, and how do I route out audio up into my helmet and back down into the radio and interface all of that stuff. So that was actually the beginning of my audio work as well.
So let's go back to APRS for a second, because when I think of APRS, I think of packet radio. I think of it as an old technology. It surprises me that people are still doing APRS or even talking about APRS. Do I have the wrong impression of APRS in terms of what it's useful for in an era when we all carry around smartphones that have GPS tracking and all that stuff in it?
So first off, keep in mind that we're talking about late 90s, early 2000s. So it was still new technology at the time. Having said that, I still think there is a place for APRS today. It's definitely still running. It's definitely still out there. It's not as useful for the everyday kinds of things that we used to use it for. Like a lot of ham radio, the practicality of ham radio has kind of been replaced by other commercial technologies, right? In the 90s, I carried my HT around so that I could communicate with my friends at any time I wanted to, right? Nowadays, we have text messages, we have Signal, we have Slack, we have whatever method we want. I don't need an amateur radio to be able to reach out to my friends at any time. There's definitely still kind of the emergency communications of what happens if the internet goes down. We can still use ham radio. That has become less of an issue because the internet has gotten so much better and the telecommunications have gotten so much better. The last several earthquakes, major earthquakes that have happened in California, because I'm in California, so that's what I think of. Like the cell networks were still up and running. Aries doesn't really get called out in the same way that we used to because the commercial systems are working so much better than they used to. Like when things really hit the fan, yeah, we're still gonna get called out, but that bar keeps rising as the commercial technologies keep getting better. And so I think we need to kind of adapt to that and realize that we're going to be used for different things. And APRS definitely still has a use for things like, I've got a weather station that I've put out in this remote space in this valley, and I don't necessarily want to have to pay for a cellular connection to the thing all the time, but just having it beacon its temperature once every 10 minutes on APRS is functionally sufficient for what I need. It doesn't cost me anything other than the hardware to build it and set it up out there. And we've got the frequencies, we might as well use it, right? So that's the kind of thing that APRS is still very good at. If I want to know where my friends are in town, like if my friend trusts me, then they can share the Find My, because I'm an iOS user, so Apple's solution to this is Find My iPhone. You don't need APRS for that sort of thing anymore. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of beaconing my position to the entire world all the time. So I don't beacon APRS very often. So those kinds of things, do we need it? Probably not, but there are still use cases where it's handy, I think.
I guess I got the impression that the way that APRS is being used now, it's almost being used for, as you say, bringing other types of communications back, like status communications, or my weather station has information, or I guess there's a host of IoT, Internet of Things kinds of applications that one could do with APRS now. Is there an infrastructure that actually supports wide area? And what does that mean? Does that mean that there's APRS repeaters or base stations on high mountaintops that are gathering information from APRS users?
So you don't need very wide area. You only need a wide enough area to get to an iGate. To get to the internet gateway, right? Or if you're doing an event like the Wildflower Triathlon, we make sure that we have enough RF coverage for that event, and then we don't bother bridging it to iGate because it doesn't matter to the rest of the world. It only matters locally, right? So to answer your direct question, yes, there absolutely is still infrastructure. I can speak to the Bay Area and San Luis Obispo because those are the two areas that I spend most of my time in, but there's definitely still infrastructure here. We've got several high-level wide 2.2 repeaters, digipeaters, APRS gates. I guess it's not a digipeater. Anyway, whatever you call the infrastructure. I'm not an APRS expert. But those wide repeaters are definitely still up there, and iGates are still up there. And the iGate doesn't actually have to be up at the high level. It only needs to be able to hear the high level repeater. And so I've got an iGate set up at my house, ignoring the fact that it's down right now, but I've got an iGate set up at my house, and I could hear the KD6DSI, I think is the call sign of the digipeater up on Tassajara Peak. Which is one of the high mountaintops around here. And I can hear that. So anything that KD6 DSI beacons or repeats I can hear, and then I send it off to the internet. And so the iGate, the internet gateway, oh my gosh, what's it called? IS, Internet Systems. The APRS IS system, the data that feeds APRS.FI or your applications that use the internet to get data from APRS. All of that will get data fed from this area through my iGate, and I'm sure there are other iGates in the area as well, not just me. But between all the iGates in the area, we will definitely beacon that, get it bridged over to the internet.
You have a very active YouTube channel. It looks like you've been doing it for 7 years.
Great gravy. Has it been that long?
The visual that I had when we connected earlier, before we started this conversation, is that the person I'm looking at now is a little bit older than the person that started the YouTube channel 7 years ago.
A few more gray hairs.
So how did the YouTube channel start, and what do you do with it?
So I refer to my YouTube channel as an accidental YouTube channel. So what happened there is I was doing some audio circuit layout for an early version of my headphone amplifier. I had been chatting with some friends on Twitter, and I said, hey, let's not live stream. It wasn't even live stream. It was Hangouts. It was Google Hangouts. I wanted to do it live on the internet and have some friends join me and chat with me while I was doing it. And so I set up the Hangout. And while I was doing this, was, like you said, 7 years ago, Google Hangouts had a feature that they had just introduced called Hangouts Live or Hangout Online, or I don't remember exactly what the feature was called at the time, but it was a checkbox when you set up the Hangout, and it just Hangouts Online. And okay, sure, whatever. And I checked the box, and my understanding of it at the time was I was going to have this Hangout where my friends joined me and we chatted about what I was doing. And then it was going to live stream it. And so if you didn't want to actively chat with me, then you could just view the live stream and watch us and listen to my friends heckle me and be peanut gallery while I tried to do some circuit layout. And that was the idea. And I set that up. Nobody ended up joining the Hangout. It was very boring. But I didn't realize that it was going to be long-term stored at the time. And so I wasn't talking. I wasn't narrating. I was just kind of boom, ba-dum, ba-dum, boom. I didn't realize that anybody was watching me at the time because nobody was watching me at the time. And so when I finished up for the night, I clicked end, and it gave a pop-up and said, all right, your video's now available. Here's the link. And I'm like, what? I didn't realize I was uploading a video. And so that was the first video on my YouTube channel, was this completely unattended live hangout of me doing circuit board layout, and it started getting views. I'm like, how the heck is this getting views? Why are people watching this? And I realized that people were watching it and were interested in the circuit board layout stuff that I was doing. I'm like, all right. So the next time I went to go work on that project, I set up a stream and realized what I was doing and actually started recording it on purpose and would look at the camera and talk about what I was doing. And I started getting a few people who joined me, not so much for the Hangouts, but in the chat room on the YouTube live stream. The Hangouts went away and they don't support that anymore anyway. But I kept doing YouTube live streams. And so my channel is not written. It's not edited. It's not anything that has any production value whatsoever. It is literally me sitting down in front of my webcam, clicking stream, starting the live stream, and then just doing work and talking at the camera as I do it. My videos tend to be between an hour and 3 hours long. I don't understand, if I'm being totally honest, I don't understand why people watch it. Because it's not the kind of video that I would want to watch, just put on in the background and have somebody mumbling about the work that he was doing. To me, it's not something I can sit down and watch because I don't put that production value into it. But people are watching it. People are enjoying it. Some of my videos have thousands of views. I mean, not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of views. I'm not going to be retiring anytime soon on that fat YouTube check. But, if I get 100 views on a video, as far as I'm concerned, that's a huge success. And I've had other people say that to them, it's like a Zen, just put it on in the background while they're working on something else. And it's just kind of zen watching me move traces around or move schematics around or do the math to figure out what value of capacitor I need to put here or, whatever. And like, all right, if you guys enjoy it, I'll keep doing it.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Well, what's interesting about your channel is that you don't have a lot of views except when you're doing a how-to. I see, for example, you're doing something, MIDI working on something, the fan dipole antenna. So that one has almost 5,000 views. Most of the recordings you have maybe under 100 views. The lesson there is that when you're actually showing somebody how to do something, like how to make a fan dipole, for example, all of a sudden that creates. You may have people that are like monitoring your channel for that how-to, or maybe they found it in the search.
I think that one was mostly search because I definitely don't have that many subscribers. But the fan dipole was actually one of the few that I've produced, quote unquote. So that one was not a live stream. I went up on the roof and started talking about it, and I was just holding my iPhone in my hand and doing a video capture or a recording video on my phone, talking about it. And then I came down off the roof and used iMovie on my phone to edit together a few of the videos that I had taken, and then I uploaded that. You'll notice that one's like, I think 15 minutes long on that order. It's much shorter, and it's on a single topic, and it's very much this is how I built mine. And you're right, those definitely get a lot more views. And so I've tried. I don't try very hard, right? Like I said, this is an accidental YouTube channel. I don't have a schedule. I don't have a syllabus of what I'm going to be going through. It's just whenever something strikes me, I'll put together a video and upload it. And sometimes they hit,
and sometimes they don't,
and sometimes they don't. Most of the time they don't, and that's fine. That's fine.
Who's Smitty Halibut?
Smitty Halibut. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. My last name is Smith. And Smitty is a common nickname for someone with the last name of Smith. My dad, KD6ZY, my dad has gone by Smitty his entire life. Like my grandmother, his mother used to call him Smitty, right? She's also a Smith, and so was her husband, my grandfather. But for some reason, my dad, her son, went by Smitty. And so when I was growing up, I was always Mark. I was never Smitty in the house until I hit high school. And my friends in high school started calling me Smitty. Don't know why. Don't know where it came from or what got them started on it. I honestly have no idea. But I'm like, I like my dad. My dad's cool. I don't mind inheriting my dad's name. And so it just happened. I don't even know how or why it happened, but it did. And so I've been known as, I started using Smitty on BBSs. That's the key, is that in the late 80s, early 90s, or most of the 90s, I started using Smitty as my handle on BBSs. And I've also been running a BBS, still run it now, been running a BBS since 1987. Doing math in my head. Is that right? 7th grade. Yes, 1987. I've been running the same BBS since 1987. It's not a dial-up BBS anymore. It is an internet access BBS, but the same group of people that have logged into it since high school still log into it most days and chat. And it's private. It's not open to the public, so don't ask me for details, but it's there. And when I started this BBS as a 7th grader at the age of 12, remember, I told you my parents are computer nerds, so I was not the typical kid hacker who could do things on the computer that his parents didn't know about. My parents knew everything I did on my computer, and it kept me honest. So I never did anything illegal when I was still living at home. All the illegal stuff came later. I didn't say that. Anyway, so I was starting my BBS when I was 12 years old, and I had a computer that was a hand-me-down family computer, and we had a modem, and I started out just running it a few hours a day, and then eventually talked my parents into getting me a phone line for my birthday present. And just every year, my birthday present was, we'll pay for this phone line to run the BBS on. And I was trying to think of a name for the BBS. I'm like, why am I running this BBS? Well, just for the hell of it. My mom looked at me like, you're 12. How about you rename it to Just for the Halibut? I'm like, okay, fine. And so my BBS became Just for the Halibut BBS. And this is the 80s and 90s. I was running it on floppy disks. Floppy disks don't last very long. And so about once or twice a year, my BBS would just die. The floppy on it that it was on would die, and it would need to be reinstalled from the ground up. And eventually it just became shortened to the Halibut BBS. Right? So I am Smitty on the Halibut BBS. That was my identity all through like junior high and high school. And then in college, my identity was more defined by my ham radio stuff. But I'm still running this BBS. And in 1990, either summer of 94 or 95, I can't remember which, very early in the internet, I registered halibut.com. And I got the domain halibut.com. And so that just kind of became my identity there. And then Smitty Halibut as a single unit came from when I tried to register for AIM, AOL Instant Messaging. And I tried Smitty, that's already taken. I tried Halibut, that's already taken. I tried a couple of other combinations, and they were all taken. And finally, I tried Smitty Halibut, and it's like, all right, that one's not taken. Boom, and that's your handle. I'm like, okay. If I would have preferred you to tell me that it was available before assigning it to me, but okay. Anyway, so I became Smitty Halibut, and I realized that is a unique enough name that it is unlikely to be taken in any new namespace. So like when Twitter came up, nobody had already registered Smitty Halibut. Okay, fine. So Smitty Halibut is now my unique enough name that it's unlikely to be already taken in any new namespace, and I can use that same name, that same identity in all of these namespaces that I participate in. And that's where I'm at. That's how I got Smitty Halibut.
You did a presentation for audio building blocks at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. How are audio building blocks used when you're applying those to amateur radio these days? And why the interest there?
I'm an audiophile. I like music. I like listening to very good quality music on very good quality headphones. And some of the headphones that I like are difficult to drive. If you try to plug them straight into a computer, they won't sound as good as they can sound. And so I started getting into headphone amplifiers and the good quality headphone amplifiers, and started learning the design of headphone amplifiers from other designs, right? So I would look at somebody else's design and say, why did they build it that way? Why did they design it that way? And I would start researching it and learning from these other DIY masters on how to do audio well. So that's one aspect of my audio hobby. The other aspect of my audio hobby is to look at ham radio and see how ham radio audio is routed. So like take, for example, I have the computer interface modules. It's an MFJ thing that plugs into the radio through the mic connector and the speaker connector, and then it's got line level in and out that goes off to the computer, right? You can't just connect those wires together because things will burn out if you do that. And so you've got to convert signal levels one way or the other, and then you've got to isolate them so that you don't have shared grounds and all these things, right? And so I opened up this MFJ box and kind of started reverse engineering the circuit to figure out what they were doing. And a lot of kind of looking at what other people are doing to solve these problems, combined with my own electrical engineering background and understanding of what of all of these things are doing, and then learning about my own mistakes of, I built a thing that I thought could be pretty simple, and I built it and it didn't work for X, Y, and Z reasons, or it didn't work well, or it sounded horrible, or whatever. And so I just kind of started building this collection of tools in my toolbox of how audio circuits can be built to solve problems. And then all of a sudden, problems started popping up all over the place that I now had tools to solve. Problems that I didn't even realize were problems. So for the example that I gave in my presentation was this satellite radio audio thing. So I started getting into FM satellites. I'm still not super into it, or I haven't had a lot of experience with it, but you've got an Arrow handheld antenna in one hand, you've got the HT in the other hand that you kind of have to adjust the frequency on as the satellite comes closer to you and then farther away from you with Doppler shift. So you've got, your hands are full. But now you also need your speaker mic to be able to, so you hold your speaker mic in your third hand, and then you of course need to log your things. So you start logging with your fourth hand, and you can see the problem that's forming here, right? I just don't have enough hands to do all of these things while I'm trying to operate an FM satellite. And so I started thinking about what would an ideal situation be? Well, I still want to be able to hold the antenna because I need to point the antenna at the satellite. I don't want to operate the radio if I can at all avoid it. And I heard from some other satellite operators that they don't actually log while they're operating. They just record the pass and then do all their logging after the fact. And so I started thinking about, like, what is a device that I could build that would do all of this, right? So I put a headset on my head. So I've got headphones and a microphone. And I need to be able to route that headset into the radio. And the radio's got a certain connector, and the PTT is part of the microphone circuit. Those are on the same line. So you need to be able to interface your PTT into this connector. So it's not just as simple as routing the headset to the radio. You actually need to, like, combine the PTT in there. So I'm definitely going to have some sort of a circuit in between them. But I also want to be able to feed radio or audio from the radio. So like the receive audio from the radio and the transmit audio from my microphone. I want to mix both of those together and feed them to another output that I can send to my phone for recording, right? So that I can record all of this stuff closed loop, but not just one audio or the other. So I now need a mixer. And I just kind of started putting together what this device was. And I sat down one day and designed it and put it together and built it, and it worked. And I have one in my hands, although some of the connectors popped off and pulled the traces off because I didn't make the traces big enough, yada, yada, yada. So I definitely want to make another revision of this. But it ultimately solved the purpose. And I started realizing that I can do more and more of these things. I sat down at field day, and we've got one radio, but we've got two operators. And we've got a headphone splitter, so both operators can be listening to the radio audio. But every time the logger needs to talk to the operator, I'm like, huh? And I pull the headphone off my head and, repeat that. And so that, like, just a headphone splitter doesn't give you intercom, right? So now I want to be able to build something that will allow the operator and the logger to be able to intercom with each other so they don't have to pull their headset off to be able to talk, but still route the audio from only one microphone to the radio so that anything the logger says doesn't get transmitted. And I want people who are walking by behind me to be able to hear. So there's a speaker output that goes to a loudspeaker so that people walking by who want to listen to what we're doing can turn up that volume and then turn it down when they're having their own conversation or whatever, right? So here's another audio-only device. There's no RF in this. There's nothing that's quote-unquote radio about it.
Don't you find it unusual that, given that field day and operations like field day, where you've got two operators sitting next to each other, one working, one logging, that these devices are not already common in the amateur radio marketplace?
I can't find them. That's the first thing I do when I run into one of these problems is like, all right, does the device already exist to solve this problem for me? And the two headset console interface for a radio, I never found one on the market, or if I did, it was several $100s, and I'm like, I'm not going to spend that much money. I can build one of these things for $50, including boards.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. We also have the problem, I've been a ham, 48 years or something like that now, and you accumulate radios in your operating position. You've got maybe your novice rig, then you got your TS520 because that's what was popular, and you've got your K2, and now you've got your 7300. This is my description. A couple of commercial FM radios that have been turned into ham radios. So, you got 5 or 6 radios on your bench. You got a lot of microphones, and you've got a lot of stuff. And you're thinking, well, where is that device that I could combine everything with one microphone, one set of speakers, maybe with some noise blanking or cancellation or things like that? Where is that box? Why is it I can't find that box to do that? And you'd think that there's got to be thousands of hams like us that have the same problem.
Yeah, and that is exactly the kind of problem that I am trying to address from a DIY standpoint. Right. There's definitely space for a commercial product that does this, but since that doesn't exist yet, I'm trying to address it from a DIY standpoint. That's exactly the problem that I am trying to solve with my headphone amplifier, actually. So to go tangent slightly into audiophile, I've got 2 computers at my desk. I've got my work laptop, my personal laptop. I've got my D700 VHF UHF radio that I monitor while I'm sitting at my desk most of the day. I've got the HF radio, and I don't want to have a whole bunch of different headsets and microphones for all of this stuff. So my desktop, when I'm at the office, I don't have space to set it up at home, but when I'm at my office, I actually have a turntable as well. I said I was an audiophile. I'm not kidding. So I have a turntable that I want to have mixed into all of this. So my headphone amplifier is actually a good quality headphone amplifier, but the front end is a mixer. You need to have an amp in there, op amp, as your amplifier, and there's really no benefit to using a non-inverting operational amplifier instead of an inverting operational amplifier. So I've taken a lot of the common DIY headphone amp designs, which tend to use non-inverting amps, and I've converted it to an inverting amp. The advantage there being that the inverting amps can have multiple inputs. So you can actually use an inverting op amp as a mixer. And so now my headphone amplifier has 4 inputs. I've got 2 USB DACs, so I've got USB cables running off to my 2 different computers, and then I've got 2 line inputs, one of which comes from the turntable preamp, and the other one comes from a speaker-level mixer that I've made that mixes the audio from my D700 and my FT920 together into a single line-level output that gets sent into the 4th channel on my headphone amp. So now I've got this audiophile quality headphone amplifier with 4 volume knobs on the front, and I can adjust the volume of my personal laptop, my work laptop, my turntable, and all of my radio gear separately.
God willing, we won't be in the middle of this pandemic next year. But do you see an opportunity or an application for being able to do the contest station where 2 people are actually separated over a long distance, maybe using the internet as a way to connect together? So you've got a guy who's working and a guy who's logging.
Gotcha.
Do you see that as an opportunity or even a possibility?
Yes, absolutely. That is likely to be a software problem, not a hardware problem, though. So the hardware side of that is pretty much already solved, right? So if I've already got a computer headset that connects to my computer, that problem is solved. And if you don't have one, you can buy one from any online vendor for $20 to $40, depending on how much you want to spend. So that gets the operator, the human to computer interface is already handled. And then the computer to radio interface is also already handled, right? A lot of modern rigs just have USB cables that connect directly to computers. Older rigs, you've got the Signal Link, you've got this MFJ interface box that I was talking about. If you can do digital modes, you can get audio from a computer into a radio. Now we have the internet in between. And so that's going to be the internet and computers in the middle of all of these I/O interfaces. And so that's going to be a software problem, not a hardware problem. I can write software, but not like that. I'm not a DSP guy. So that is going to be an application for somebody else to write. I do think there is a space for that. We were actually looking at Field Day this year. Our our field day site is High Mountain in San Luis Obispo County. One of our club members has a literal line of sight to High Mountain, as in he can stand on his porch with a telescope and view the building, like look directly at the building on the mountaintop where we operate. So we were contemplating setting up a Wi-Fi link between the two houses with directional antennas, or between his house and the Condor Lookout at the top of the mountain, and getting our own internet up there, and then having like one person go to the mountaintop with a flex radio and set up some antennas, and then just kind of camp out for the weekend. And then that flex radio becomes available over the internet for any of the rest of the club members to use. We didn't actually do it for various different reasons. We just kind of ran out of time, but we kind of had the design in our head of how to make this work.
How do you make time for amateur radio?
How do you make time? Well, it helps that my daughter is now 13 and mostly self-sufficient. When she was younger, it was a lot harder, and there were several years where I was kind of idle on ham radio. I'm one of those ham radio operators that is more interested in the build and the technology than in the operating. And I am comfortable saying that out loud, but I think a lot of hams are self-conscious when they realize this about themselves. Like, why am I in a hobby about talking to other people when I don't like making small talk with other people? And especially with the climate today, and anyway, I'm not going to get into politics. There are people that I don't want to find myself in conversations with, and so I tend to avoid starting random conversations with people I don't know. I am much more interested in the community that I already know. And so it's not a very popular opinion, but I like aspects of ham radio that allow me to find my community and talk to my community, and am less interested in talking to random people.
I've said this all along, and I think I've hopefully demonstrated it with the expo earlier in the month. Ham radio is such a huge circus tent, with a lot of different sideshows. There's really something for everyone. If you're not a DXer or a rag chewer or a contester, but you're a builder, you like to solve problems. I saw in one of the most recent ARRL magazines using the 122 gigahertz LiDAR chips to make contacts. So taking a chipset that's normally used in an automobile and using it to make a contact across a valley on 122 gigahertz is something that we do. So I think that there's plenty of room for people like you who like to concentrate on ham radio problems and work those out on the workbench or with a CAD system and not necessarily be on the air all the time.
Yeah, speaking of 122 gigahertz, pure wizardry. I don't know how those guys do it. That is insane, and I love everything about it. Those guys are pushing the boundaries, and that is fantastic. So mad props to the folks who are pushing the upper boundaries of frequencies. I mean, you're practically infrared at this point, and I am super impressed. My hat's off to you guys. Yeah, and I think there is a lot of space for people who are building. I can't remember whether Jeremy is the one who said it, but I give him credit. KF7IJZ, he describes ham radio as the hobby of 1,000 hobbies, right? There is no one thing that defines ham radio. And if there's certain aspects of the hobby you don't enjoy as much as others, great. Ignore those aspects of the hobby. Go to the ones that do interest you, right? And don't let anyone tell you that you're not a real ham. I hate that phrase. I despise that phrase with a fiery passion. You're not a real ham because you do X, or you're not a real ham unless you do Y. I hate that it's so much, because there is nothing that defines ham radio except Part 97, right? You can do so much with that, or okay, at least in the United States, FCC Part 97, wherever you are in the world, your local equivalent of that. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you have to do X or that you must do Y to be a ham radio operator. That is just not true. You find what aspect of the hobby that you enjoy, and you do that, and you show them how wrong they were, right? That is something I feel very strongly about. You may be interested in an aspect of the hobby that I don't care for. Great. More power to you. Guess what? I'm going to be interested in an aspect of the hobby that you're probably not interested in. You let me do that, because there are so many different things. There's no wrong way or right way to do it. And I love hearing people get passionate about anything, really, but ham radio in this context. And if you're passionate about that, great. I am super excited about your passion. Even though I may not be passionate about what you are passionate about, I am passionate that you are passionate. And that is wonderful. And that is one of the best things about ham radio, is that there is so much there to love.
Also, when you're around passionate people, you kind of tend to get excited by what they're doing, even if it's something that you're not doing.
Exactly. I'm passionate by their passion. Yeah.
That's right. Has social distancing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, has it changed your amateur radio operation and routine?
Yeah, it's actually increased my on-the-air stuff, believe it or not. So now I'm at home. I'm working at home where I have a D700 sitting at my desk, and I've got the audio routed into my headset. So I can actually monitor 2-meter call and our countywide repeater system while I am working. I don't get a lot of activity on 2-meter call, but it's non-zero. And I never really monitored 2-meter call long-term before this. But occasionally I'll hear someone driving through town, because the main freeway artery through town, 101, has a bunch of truckers and whatnot. And occasionally they'll be on 2-meter call, and they'll just pop up and call CQ or whatever, right? So there's some activity there that I've never used to participate in. And then the countywide system is not so busy that I have to turn it off so that I can concentrate on work, but it's busy enough that, there's some activity going on there. And again, when I'm at the office, I'm not monitoring that. So I've actually been more active since the pandemic than I was before it. Unfortunately, the pandemic does mean that we aren't meeting in person. And I had just started a local club called CQ805. 805 is the area code that we live in. And so I had just started a club about 6 months before the pandemic hit called CQ805. And we had started doing lunchtime meetings. Like, most of us were working stiffs, and we could get away for an hour lunch, maybe an hour and a half lunch in the middle of the workday. And so we'd pick a restaurant this week, and we'd go hang out and chat about things, or somebody would do a presentation. And that has obviously stopped. We have not done a good job of replacing our, not somewhat periodic get-togethers with some sort of virtual equivalent. We haven't done that. And we probably should. John Portune at W6NBC lives about 15 miles south of me, about 10 miles south of me. And he's the one who did the slot antenna presentation at the QSO Today Expo. And that was one of my favorite videos, by the way. If you haven't seen that one, there's the antenna, the double cross delta. I can't remember exactly what the term was, but the antenna that he presented at the very end of that, I'm going to build one of those, because if it's as awesome as he says it is, and he provides all the physics to back up why it is the way it is, that is potentially one of the best HF antenna options available for people that don't have giant farms, right? That don't have giant property for setting up big antennas. And so I very much want to build one of those things.
We should point out, John was a guest very early. Maybe I should have him again, but I think he was in the first 10 interviews that I did 6 years ago. And he's a real expert on antennas that you want to put in places where you're not allowed to have antennas.
Yes, exactly.
So he's the guy you want to go to. I'll put a link in the show notes pages on how to get to his stuff. He's fascinating from that standpoint, especially if you live in neighborhoods that don't allow antennas. I think I saw something in a recent QST where he's turned a wind vane into a
Yep.
2 meter. So you can get that antenna way above the roof because you've got a wind vane with a rooster, and that happens to be a very effective antenna.
I've got him agreed to give a Zoom presentation to the club. So we need to schedule that and make that happen. And then we're also thinking of what kind of socially distant activities we could do. And we realized that a tea hunt is probably a good candidate because you're out on your own trying to hunt a thing. You don't have to be close to the other people. And so we're looking at scheduling tea hunts as well.
What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
I'm hesitating because I'm not going to tell you the same answers that a lot of people would say. Honestly, I think our biggest challenge is ourself. There are so many doomsayers of, FT8 is ruining the hobby, or young kids today, they don't get into ham radio. And I disagree with both of those statements. See my earlier statements about you do you, and whatever aspect of the hobby you enjoy, then that's the aspect for you. FT8 falls into that category. A lot of people kind of up in the rag chew areas of the HF bands are seeing less activity on the rag chew areas, and so they think their aspect of the hobby is dying. But a lot of that activity has moved down to CW, ironically, although I'm sure a lot of people predicted that once you took away the requirement for CW, you get a lot of people into the hobby, and then they realize that CW is actually a lot of fun, and they want to do it now. And they didn't learn it because they had to learn it. They want to learn it now, and that's the best way to learn a thing. I don't think the activity is decreased. I think it's moving, it's shifting, it's changing. And I don't see any real signs that things are a challenge, right? I think the things that's going to cause harm is our own complaints about the hobby, right? If you've got a new person who's trying to come into the hobby, they're going to be much more interested in joining a hobby with people that are excited about all these new things that they're doing than to join a hobby of a bunch of people, let's be honest, old white guys, complaining about how the hobby isn't the same as it used to be. Honestly, that is the biggest hurdle, in my opinion, of getting new people interested in the hobby. We used to be able to make a great argument of, well, I carry it with me so that I can contact my friends anytime. Well, I've got my cell phone for that. We use HF to meet new people around the world, people we wouldn't have otherwise been able to communicate with. Well, now we've got the internet. I use it to talk to my dad without having to pay long distance. Well, long distance is pretty much free now, right? Between cell phones, internet, and cheaper free long distance, all of the quote-unquote practical reasons we got our ham licenses back in the 80s and 90s don't really apply anymore. I don't need an auto patch to order a pizza on my way to the pizza restaurant. I can do that with my cell phone now.
Although you couldn't do that legally on ham radio.
You could, because anyway, that's a whole different tangent. We'll talk about that. There's debate on that one.
I think I could give some homework. I've never done this before, but maybe I'll give some homework to the QSO Today listeners. And that is, I can't think of how many times I've said to somebody that I'm doing something in ham radio or amateur radio. And if they're a little bit older, they'll say, amateur radio, people are still doing that? And at that moment, I should have a 30-second elevator pitch on ham radio that I can give it to them the real picture of ham radio, and that is it's the most exciting hobby now than it has ever been because of all of the technology that we can leverage. But for some reason, I always come up short. And so if I'm going to put it out there, because lately people have been sending me other kinds of messages, but if they like sending me messages, they should send me a message and say, here's my 30-second elevator pitch for ham radio. Because I think that we really do ourselves a disservice that we can't promote ourselves, because we have everything. I mean, we have it all, and for some reason, that's where we come up short, is we just don't have the ability to articulate in a short period of time to people who think that we're dinosaurs and should go away.
So let me give you my 30-second elevator pitch, and I'll try to keep it into 30 seconds. But it's a hobby, like any other hobby. It doesn't have to be practical. I do it because I enjoy it, because it gives me a forum in which to experiment and play and do things, right? Why do people collect stamps? Why do people play music? Why do people, fix up cars? It's not because it's practical. They do it because they enjoy it. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys the kinds of things that ham radio does, then it's a way to be able to play with those things legally, and with some guidance and have a bunch of other people to play with. It's a hobby. It doesn't need to be anything else.
What advice did you give to newer returning hams then?
Well, kind of that, right? Is don't be afraid to experiment. Look for the aspect of the hobby that strikes your fancy. There are so many different things. And I'd be happy to talk to you about some of those things. I know about a lot of them. I'm experienced in several of them. And getting me to shut up is usually the hard part. So I will happily talk your ear off about any of these if you've got questions. But find the thing that you enjoy and dive into it. And don't be afraid to try things and say, that didn't really excite me. Contesting didn't really do it for me. Or, whatever, FT8, it's just hitting buttons. Okay, that doesn't excite me. Great, find something else. And, look for the people who are interested in that thing as well. They're out there. I guarantee you they're out there. You might have to search a little bit to find them, but go find them and find people who are passionate about the things that you want to be passionate about and go do awesome things. It's there. Find the people who can help you find it and go do it.
I think that's great advice. And of course, I would also advise people to peruse YouTube for different areas of ham radio, because certainly everybody who's doing anything on ham radio and themes and variations of that are on YouTube right now. And so never have we had in the history of the human species the ability to gain so much information almost instantly on just about any subject. Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was a blast, and I've listened to you on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast before, and you made a terrific contribution with your presentation at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. So I wanted to make sure that I had you and had the opportunity for the audience to actually hear more about Mark Smith, KR6ZY.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present at the QSO Today Expo. I have a feeling that 10 or 20 years from now, I'm going to look back on that opportunity and I already consider it an honor, but 20 years from now, I was there for the first one. I was one of the presenters, and that's going to be a feather in my cap, and I'm going to be very proud of that. I was super impressed at the quality of the presentations and honestly of the exhibitor hall as well. I was surprised to see how useful that was just to browse around. I didn't have very high expectations of that part. I kind of knew that the presentations were going to be awesome, but the exhibitor hall was pretty amazing as well. The whole thing went off so well, was so entertaining and educational. And I am truly honored to be a part of that. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for being a part of it. 73, Mark.
73s, mate. Cheers.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mark. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KR6ZY in the search box at the top of the page. Just a reminder that the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is still available with all of its content until September 9th. The only thing that is not active is the chat system. All of the presentations are there in the auditorium. We hope to have the Q&A that we spliced from 180 gigabytes of video available soon. If you did not register, you still can. Go to qsotodayhamexpo.com and push the yellow button right at the top of the page that will take you to the expo site. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available in iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn."
Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him.
Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.